For most people, authorship creates what I call financial downstreaming. It's a process where it sees the money that you continually earn going from your pocket into the pockets of somebody else. In fact, lots of somebody else's. And you don't even know who they are. But somehow we've been conditioned into this mindset of earn, spend and borrow, or these work cycles of earn, spend and borrow, where as soon as you get it, somebody else is actually harvesting it. If you could see how many pounds were actually in your pocket, you know, on average, Australians spend over 116% of every dollar they earn. Americans spend about 146 of every dollar they earn. So by the time they get to the end of the working life, there's not much left. In fact, there is less than not much left because of the debt that they're carrying through. So that's financial downstreaming. And so to turn that around, you've got to turn the authorship around. Augmented authorship is also the major reason why goal setting is actually very difficult for most people, because most of your goals have been set during the augment. And they're subconsciously embedded into your mind, which is why people can't change. And the older we get, the more difficult it is to change. And again, that's just age-related shrinkage. But it's one of the really big reasons why people can't set goals. But there's another reason for it, which I'll explain a little bit later. So that's also why a new approach and a new understanding needs to be considered in order to take your business results to a new level. And all of that is available, that knowledge, that support. I mean, you know, this is part of that process. So authorship is really important to understand, because if you think about whatever you're authoring can only ever generate the results. And yet you can actually see other people who have an entirely different set of results. There's not many of them, but you can actually see them. You can talk to them, you can shake their hand. They just basically look like us, they talk like us, all of that sort of stuff. But the way that they author into the world is very, very different. And so they're living in the same space and time as you. They're accessing the same space, the same information as you. They're just processing it a different way. They're using the same skill sets as most everybody else. They're just processing it a different way. And so we've got to access the way that they process. Otherwise, we'll continue to process like, you know, the status quo processes or the majority processes. So it's really important, because augmented authorship, which is what we've been socially engineered into, can only ever produce the status quo. And the status quo for most Australians is debt rather than freedom, or servitude rather than independence, whichever way you want to sort of shape it up. And it's reason only 3% ever achieve or come close. And so here's what happens in the mind, and it happens at lightning speed. If you think about, I have a thought, which you call it a desire, call it a concern, call it whatever you will. But let's say the thought is, you know, I actually want to improve, I want to learn, I want to grow, I want to evolve my results. And as soon as you actually start stepping forward, it's actually going to become uncomfortable. It'll cost you too much time, it'll cost you too much money, it'll cost you too much energy, whatever it is, there's going to be a thought form, hang on, I don't know if I can really do this, I'm not smart enough, I'm not cool enough, whatever it is, and I have a thought form that says I'm uncomfortable. Now, generally, that's the augment. It's the conditioning, it's a survival mechanism, so it's always going to feel uncomfortable. So in order to progress, we've got to give new meaning to the word uncomfortable, because if you do the augmented meaning, if you just rely on the augmented meaning, as soon as you feel uncomfortable, what's going to make you do? Actually step back into safety. And so that's where we don't want to go. We never want to go back into our comfort zone. Of course, unless you're actually on the edge of a cliff and somebody's saying jump and you don't have a rope, that's fine. But we don't want to go into our comfort zone, which is really just the monkey zone. You know, it's the monkey on your mind, it's the monkey chatter and all of that sort of business, because as soon as we go back there, our comfort zone is, well, it produces familiar. The term familiar, the word familiar comes from familiare, which essentially is family. And one of the things that human beings want to do over and above everything else is keep family, keep family around, because it's a survival mechanism. So you go into this familiar zone, and that familiar zone produces your beliefs, and those beliefs produce your behavior produces your results actually set your mind in place, they become habits, and here we go round and we go round in the circle over and over again, except we're going counterclockwise instead of clockwise. So we want to be travelling forward, but we can't do that because that's what augmented authorship is all about. It's the status quo. And so we have this mind process that absolutely epitomises that. And so then it becomes your signature thinking loop. So it doesn't matter what you author, there's a signature, just like your handwriting, just like your personality. It's just a signature that you now are authoring into the space all the time. Viktor Frankl said, look, when we are no longer able to change a situation, then we are challenged to change ourselves. In other words, you're challenged to change your authorship. And if you don't change your authorship, then you can't change the situation. So to achieve this, it's necessary to create new thinking loops. New thinking loops really mean that we've got to start getting feedback from where we want to be. So we only ever now want to associate something relative to the outcome that we actually want. And we've got to detach from associating it to where we've always been. That'll be, of course, the hardest thing because it needs a lot of learning and a lot of support. But if you think about the augment, or you think about the authorship that comes from these old codes, then nothing new can come from augmented authorship. It's impossible. So what we've got to do is find some way of actually hanging up on the past. And we only now want to make everything relative to what we want. So when you have a thought, whether you have a feeling, whether you have an opportunity, whether you have a habit, a belief, a behaviour, whatever is going on, you ask the question, is this thought, belief, behaviour, attitude, feeling, is this effective or ineffective relative to the outcome that I want? Because if you're saying this is right, wrong, good and bad, that's from the old habits. If you're saying this is uncomfortable, that's from the past. All you've got to do is say, will it effectively promote my journey from A to B, which is where you say that you want to be. And until we can do that, and that's just, again, that's just a bit of a practice, and that's how I had to reinvent myself. And I'm an artist just like anybody else. I will always be that image. Inside, I am still that image. Doesn't matter how lumpy I've become or how saggy the skin has become, that image is firmly embedded there. Buckminster Fuller said, you never change a thing by fighting the existing reality. To change something, you've got to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Because if you continue working through the existing model, you continue to work through augmented authorship. And augmented authorship can only ever get you the status quo. Now that's exactly what I did. I sat there and said, well, okay, how do I actually build a new model? I didn't know the answer to that. And so my skill set basically is trial and error. I couldn't figure out the answers prior to me actually discovering the answers. I'm not a very good reader. In fact, both my parents were deaf mutes, and I was born in the bush in Tasmania, so I didn't actually learn to speak till very, very late. And when you go to school and you don't speak, and the nuns get hold of you and they go chatter, 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 nobody stuck a label on me saying, this kid's deaf, this kid grew up, his auntie was deaf, his uncle was deaf, his mother's deaf, my father was deaf, I lived in the bush. And so when the nuns speak to you, they require a certain response. I had no idea what they were saying. And of course my parents couldn't explain because they're deaf. And so corporal punishment was my tuition for about the first 15 years, then they sent me to the Christian Brothers, and anything that you've ever heard about the Christian Brothers, I am personally here to guarantee that it's actually all true. Developing a new feedback mechanism makes your existing model obsolete. Developing a new feedback mechanism that references the results that you want actually keeps you moving forward. It keeps you moving forward because you are referencing what is essentially a goal. If you think about Edmund Hillary climbing up Mount Everest, he had 2 or 3 goes, but each go he got higher and higher and higher. And then when he found a roadblock, okay, so descend, work out a way how you can actually get past that roadblock. But he knew where it was. Everybody knew where it was. And the way to get there was already there. It was already there. They just had to find it. Does that make sense? And now we can go to the moon. Now we have a click of the mouse, we can talk all the way around the world, 10 times over. But we still find it really, really difficult to talk ourselves into focusing on exactly what we want and detaching from the status quo, detaching from ordinary results. So I went off and I started working with the smartest people I could find at the time. So I spent a year with Tony Robbins. That's at Skibo Castle. If you've never been there, it's absolutely great. Play golf at midnight. It's still very, very bright at midnight. I had the pleasure of chatting with Harry Dent, if anybody knows Harry Dent. Spent long conversations on planes, on helicopters, up mountains, down mountains, and just, it's a great company to hang around with. This is Robert Prechter. Robert Prechter holds the record, and he still holds it, the record for the biggest amount of profit from one trade in one day. He's a great mind to engage with, and Tony's he's an absolute blast. He's good fun to hang around with. So I discovered that truly successful people author from a particular place. They author from what is called their innate genius because it's twice as productive and it only takes half the amount of effort. So if you can tap into your innate genius, which is what we've schooled out of, the augment schools us out of that, trains us out of it, so it sits there and it's untapped. But it takes half the amount of energy to do something and it's twice as productive. So if we could x-ray your mind, we would actually find that every individual in the room actually has a hidden form of genius. And this is the work of Carl Jung, for those of you that are familiar with his work. Your genius describes the way that your mind works at its deepest level. And it's got to do with the cognitive preferences that you're actually born with. So it's part of your DNA. We all have different cognitive preferences, but we're all schooled through the same cognitive process. And that's, if you just luck out, there's 16 different types, there's 16 styles. If you luck out and have the style that school's in, you'll do extremely well. But if you're an intuitive, you're not going to fit in. So you have to go to a secondary or a tertiary process in order just to survive the environment. But it's not your highest preference. It's not the highest preference you were born with. Okay, so there's this cognitive presence we're born with, and then there's this learning. So we've got the old nature-nurture sort of thing. What I want to do is find out what nature gave you and look at what nurture has done to you. And then we can start to move forward from there. So it's got to do with the cognitive preferences. In other words, how you perceive information, how you take it in. We know we take it in through the senses, but it doesn't actually tell us how it hits the attention center of your brain. What we want to know is what's your preference for what actually gets through to your particular part of perception, and then how you start to make decisions based on the information that's actually getting through. So your true genius has a tremendous influence on the way that you think, the way that you produce success in your business, the type of wealth you could produce, the type of relationships that you actually have. I think John Gray wrote the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus or something like that. It's kind of sort of two planets. That's the way that cognitive preferences work. And often you can be talking to somebody, but they're on I guess you've all had the experience, you're talking to somebody and they're on a different planet. It's really just two cognitive preferences that can't actually do a dance. But we don't know why. And so if we can't access our primary ones, we don't know, well, maybe there's secondary ones that we've got in common we can access there before we can try and ratchet it up a bit. For example, Oprah is one of the most successful talk show hosts ever. But if she actually tried to build her wealth through shares, she probably wouldn't succeed because it's not suitable for her particular type of genius. Warren Buffett were to become a talk show host. He definitely wouldn't succeed, especially if you know Warren Buffett. It's unlikely that he would be as successful as he is today, being the richest man on the planet who has generated all his wealth out of shares. Oprah has a harmony genius, and that harmony genius, when it's really honed and developed, allows her to connect and empathize at the highest levels possible. But it also allows her to overcome tremendous hardships. And if you know anything about Oprah's life, you really do know the hardships that she's actually overcome. But you wouldn't see it in her. You wouldn't see it in her. You just know it's there, but it's not evidence. So if everybody followed exactly what Oprah did, if you didn't have the same genius type, you wouldn't be as successful because it's not your true genius. And anything that's not your true genius requires more energy and it sucks up more time. It's harder to actually do. Warren Buffett has a memory genius. And so there's a strong preference for collating information, analysing and systemizing processes. So collating information means that he's got a strong preference for actually looking back in time. He's got a strong preference for collating the known world. So he's got a strong preference for something that is known, something that's provable, something that's quantifiable, something that's measurable. Well, as an artist, that's the last thing that you actually want to play in. You want to play in the possibilities of the future. So again, if you're being made at work to try and, go back in the past, it's just it's a round hole in a square peg. The other way around. So he searches for real facts and provable information. So he's ideally suited to proven, underline the word proven, low risk long-term investment strategies. That's why he's super skilled at. And the way that Buffett collects information and then makes decisions on that is actually not the same for everybody. So his memory genius and the way that he's actually developed it over the years actually gives him a huge advantage. There are other people with memory geniuses, they just don't develop it. Donald Trump has got a sensation genius. So he loves sales and deal making. So sales and deal making all happen in present time. People who bungee jump have probably got a sensation genius. People who base jump and those sorts of things, it's all about the here and now. A lot of gymnasts are all about the here and now. A lot of elite sports people are about, musicians are all about the here and now. It's what they feel in their body. So he's interested in outcomes and the here and now, and that's where he gets his biggest energy surges from. But he's also interested in he's actually not interested so much in the end deal, the end product. He's interested in the process of getting there. And obviously he wants to win. So Trump thrives on excitement, he thrives on challenge, and he thrives on winning. So he's good at calculating the risks, and he's really good at calculating the angles. He's a great negotiator. He's attracted to high stakes processes because they offer that immediate sensory sort of input and the adrenaline surges. How many times has Trump fallen down? But he always gets back up, and he always has a way to come through. But if he tried to do work like Buffett does, then he wouldn't succeed. And if Buffett tried to do what Donald Trump does, then he wouldn't actually succeed because they're not working in their true genius. So each genius actually authors from a different set of perspectives and a different set of decision criteria. So your perception is different than most people without the same genius or without the same cognitive preference. Your decision making is also unique, and it may be different for the way that most people actually behave. So there's always going to be this misfit, but we don't know where it's coming from. So my genius style is exploration. It's an intuitive approach. As an artist, you would probably expect that. It's very creative. It's very inventive. And so all I did was take that curiosity, the inventiveness, the creativeness, and apply it to the medium of money instead of the medium of clay. And then the outcome was vastly different. So I already had the skill sets, I just had to change medium, if that makes sense. Exploration enjoys entrepreneurial business ventures. It doesn't actually fear loss because anything, especially if a potter, I really did have a high loss. I would make 10 pieces for one because they would all explode in the kiln, but I couldn't get the colours in any other way. So I was prepared to sacrifice 10. And when I say sacrifice 10, that could be a month's work. But I was prepared to risk all of that for the one that I actually, that I could get to succeed. Exploration pushes boundaries. It's a natural, curious, inventive, innovative, optimistic, future possibility thinking style. And so I love going into the future. I love being uncomfortable because every time I'm uncomfortable, that means I'm actually learning something. The way that I can do that is because I've given the new meaning to the word uncomfortable. If I was giving the evolutionary meaning, if I'm uncomfortable, that means something is about to eat me and I'm gonna die soon. So that would then make me step back into safety. That's a survival mechanism. But whenever I'm uncomfortable, I now know that I'm actually out of my depths, so I'm actually in the future, so I'm now forward of myself. And that's where I always want to be. Because how could I learn anything? If I'm back here, I'm just working on familiar information. If I'm there and I'm uncomfortable, I don't get too uncomfortable, but it's always take one step until that sort of discomfort becomes comfortable, take another step. So it's always a forward-looking possibility thinking process. So exploration is passionate about progress and helping others. That's what I've been doing now for the last 16 years. It's great at teamwork, it's great at mentoring, it's great at helping people get more potential from themselves because it's a future possibility style, And that future possibility style, it's only available in about 12.5% of the population. 75% of the population have got a known world cognitive preference. If Oprah, Humphrey and Trump didn't actually work within their true geniuses, they probably wouldn't be as successful, and we probably wouldn't hear about them. So each genius style has a different risk profile. Each genius style has a different preference for the way it handles money. Each style has blind spots, which means that you yourself can't see your own blind spots. You know, our eyes have natural blind spots, but also our mind has natural blind spots, which those blind spots always default to the augment, whatever the augment is, because it's so conditioned into the subconscious mind. Unless we actually, build new programs in there and make new programs the default, we will always go to the old default. And so we always go to those bunches of programs over there rather than the new codes where we say we want to go to. So it always defaults to augmented authorship, and then the status quo actually remains. So aligning your natural behavioural preferences make you far more likely to pursue the right opportunities in the right way at the right time to get the results that you desire. And that's basically one of the big lessons that I learned from spending a year with Tony. So you need to know how to use and develop your genius so that it actually benefits the outcomes that you say that you want. Those outcomes that you say that you want then must be set as a concrete intention. Now, the thing that you then have to do is attend to your intention. And the moment that you are not attending to your intention is the moment that you actually lose consciousness and go about your life on an automatic pilot. And so the moment you are attending to your intention is the moment that you're moving forward. The moment you disconnect from that is the moment you step back into the familiarity of the status quo. So there are 16 types of genius, and one of them represents the cognitive preferences that you're actually born with. Augmented authorship actually suffocates that preference unless you are lucked out and you are the one of the 16 type that the social engineers loved, or that the social engineers use to basically augment. So basically discovering my genius allowed me to do some particular things. So when I started my journey, I was still a potter. In fact, in the last 3 years of being a potter, up until 1999, so I started my journey in 94. I became quite successful by 98, but I was still a potter in all of that time. So I was still exhibiting. I had my last exhibition in 99, and I was working at, in fact, I was the head of 3D studies at one of the universities in Perth on a salary of $50,000. Okay, so that was my whole artistic teaching, sharing salary. But then I started to understand business. This is after I had become successful in real estate and shares. I then started to understand the medium of business. And so I started a business part-time, and I generated $77,000 out of that business. Okay, this is the first year that I started. Now, can you imagine going up to your head of department saying, can I actually have 151% raise, please? They're going to look at you really strange, aren't they? Especially, I still had the hair and the beard and all of that, and they did look at me very, very strange. And so I took responsibility. I just went out there and gave myself a pay rise. I got a little bit bitter the next time. Next year, I actually turned that into $1.8 million, which is actually an increase of 2,337%. It's really good when you can actually control those numbers, or you can actually be responsible for those percentage increases. The following year, I turned it into $3.4 million, and again, I'm not doing anything different, I'm just getting better at it, if that makes sense. Again, that's a further increase of 189%, and since, for the last 16 years, it's been multiple 6- and 7-figure incomes. I aim for a 7-figure income every year, sometimes I just miss. And I'm not saying that to be arrogant or impress. I'm just saying I don't set my goal. I'm not interested in multiples. I'm really just interested in being free and then helping, support the people that are closest to me and my family. They're basically the major beneficiaries. I myself personally don't use much at all. I just look after a lot of people. The problem is if you don't know what your genius style is, you actually can't use its efficacy to guarantee that you're on the right path, or even be able to tap into it if you find yourself that you're actually on the wrong path, which is one of the challenges. So within the status quo, most people get into the wrong business at the wrong time, or in fact they use the wrong wealth building strategies that work for other people but don't work for them because there's just a mismatch in the way that they perceive and process information. As an indicator of using the wrong cognitive process is when actually time drags for you instead of flies, especially at work. If you tend to watch the clock a bit, it's just dragging. When you're actually in your genius, the time disappears. It's that space where there just is no time. And often you hate getting dragged back into the real world. And the intuitives will really, really know what that means if they work. But when work starts to feel like work, you know that you're actually accessing a cognitive preference that is just not, or a cognitive process is just not your genius. Another indicator is actually feeling stuck. And so if you're not using your true genius, you'll keep finding problems instead of solutions. Anybody got that sort of pattern going on? The direction in which you look for information is also a good indicator in terms of what your natural genius is. So we have this thing called the present, we have this thing called the future, we have this thing called the past. And as Einstein said, well, it's all make-believe anyway. There is only now. But anyway, so we'll use the status quo. So do you tend to look for information that already exists? So you're a collator. Or do you tend to be creative and inventive and just keep dreaming up lots and lots and lots of new ideas, but not really being able to do anything about them? So I've got this, trunk loads of new ideas, but I don't action any of them because as soon as I take action, get uncomfortable, or back into safety, and the status quo remains the same. So looking back into the known world is all about trying to find facts and proof. And often I've been told, I come up with a creative idea and then somebody says, well, that'll never work. How do we know? I haven't even given birth to the idea yet. And yet they're already judging it. They're judging it on a set of criteria. They don't know how it will work, so of course for them it will never work. But I'm going to keep trial and error until I actually figure out how to make it work. It's different planets. It's not right, wrong, good or bad, it's just different planets. But they look back into trying to prove it. Okay, prove it. Oh, I can't prove it yet, I just thought about it. Give me 10 years, I'll bring it back. Oh, it's taking too long. Well, fine, you work at your 40-hour-a-day, 40-year job, and I'll see you. It just doesn't make sense to me, but it never does. The future world is all about trial and error. It's all about speculative stuff. It's all about made-up stuff. Because we can't prove anything, can we? And of course, blessed boys, the gang of three they're called, Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, they wanted critical thinking and they wanted debate and they wanted proof and they wanted argument. It's really difficult when you're just making stuff up to argue a fact. And so again, it's just that sort of, so I just stay away from the people that just want to argue. Reflective styles need more entrepreneurial support, whereas intuitive styles, they need more detailed support moving forward. So if you're reflective, you need to be working with an intuitive and vice versa, because then you've got all of the spectrums covered. And if you want a third person, then get a sensation on your team, because then they will be the good sales, the good deal makers. If you use a cognitive process for a business model that doesn't actually suit you, then cycles of stress and augment will just continue to be unresolved. But the problem is you don't know why, you don't know what's going on. But it all amounts to the same thing, which is basically the loss of potential. So the thing about your innate genius, it's not fixed, it's not static, and it actually can be developed into a mature version of its potential. And again, that's just activity, that's just repetition, repetition, repetition. In the same way that anybody develops anything, it's all done through repetition. Whether it's repetition in the mind, whether it's repetition in physical process, whether it's a combination, but it's repetition, repetition, repetition. Undeveloped, each genius style sort of just rests there as untapped potential until it actually gets purposely awakened. Because the thing that most people are accessing is what the augment basically conditioned into them. So what people access is what nurture gave them, not necessarily what nature has provided you with. And we can get along fine. We can all exist in the world, and most people do. That's why 98% or 97% just get the status quo, but they can't get more than that. So you've got to think about that. So it's got to be purposely awakened, it's got to be taught, it's got to be amplified, it's got to be strengthened by practice and transferred into real life situations, because then that's when you get the real life feedback. Psychologist Howard Gardner maintains that each genius is independent of each other. He talked about multiple intelligences. There's multiple genii. Each has its own strengths, each has its own weaknesses, and each genius needs to be developed through an unencumbered mind. Mindset is an encumbered mind. Mindset, set mind. We never want to go there. But unfortunately, that's what the augment produces. So in order to develop into their mature expressions, each genius needs three factors to be present. A, it needs a role model for that particular genius. Because the mirror neurons will guarantee that if you can emulate somebody, it will actually give you the fastest learning. And if you can immerse yourself in that environment, the mirror neurons will automatically download the success strategies. But if you just stay there, for example, if you think about if you were to move from where you are now and you were to go into, I don't know, the deepest, darkest area of the Amazon jungle and start living with the natives, for example, there's not much you would actually know how to do. And you don't even have the language. But if you survive, in other words, if you, don't lose your life, in a very, very short time, you'll actually be able to survive in that environment. And then a little bit later, you'll start to learn the language. It's actually your mirror neurons that are doing that because they're your survival neurons. They actually bypass all of the subconscious mind. There's a direct thing. So again, if you can immerse yourself in the environment, in the supportive environment that you need, that will produce the results you want, that's the fastest way you'll actually do it. But unfortunately, most people can't do that. You also need a dedicated program of learning for that particular genius. If it's business genius, then you need a dedicated program of learning for that. If it's relationship, then you need a dedicated learning program for that. And you also need a supportive psychosocial environment for that particular genius. And that's the hardest thing to get. Very, very rarely do we actually have unconditional support, even from our partners. We have sort of, conditional support most of the time. Mark Twain observed that the inability to forget is far more devastating than the inability to remember. In other words, you can't let go. So in other words, it's failing to get off the augmented learning treadmill is far more devastating than not knowing what to do. And yet people say, because I don't know what to do, I won't get off the treadmill. And of course, the status quo just kicks in and basically it sets minds, or it's the mindset. So failing to let go of old stuff actually traps you in a comfort zone. And so if you think about augmented authorship, it reinforces comfort zone.